Let's chat! Participants during the original broadcast are invited to join in a live discussion using the chat box below.
I'd like to talk to you about the genetics of albinism, or how albinism is inherited and passed from generation to generation. So first, the definition about albinism. It's a congenital genetic abnormality of melanin synthesis in which the amount of pigment or melanin made by the pigment cell or melanocyte is reduced or absent. So saying that in plain English, that is, it's present from birth, and it's an inability to make melanin pigment. That is the pigment of our skin, hair, and eyes. It always includes very specific abnormalities of the eye and visual system. Now, albinism is not just one gene. There are many different genes that lead to albinism. We classify this in terms of the albinism that affects the skin, hair, and eyes as oculocutaneous albinism. And there are at least 7, 8, maybe more different forms of oculocutaneous albinism. There's also what we call ocular albinism. And when we talk about this in a genetic sense, this always refers to a gene on the X chromosome, which is responsible for ocular albinism 1, or OA1. There are other types of genetic conditions that feature albinism, plus other different health issues. And for example, this would include the Hermansky-Pudlak syndrome genes, of which there are several. So as I mentioned, albinism is always defined by ocular features. And those ocular features include a reduction in iris and retinal pigment, that is, the amount of pigment in the front of the eye and in the back of the eye. It also includes iris translucency, also called globe transillumination. This is, for example, if you take a flashlight and shine it from the side of the eye, you can actually see light coming out of the iris, that is that pigmented part of the eye in the front. There's also a problem with the fovea. Fovea is in the back of the eye, in the retina, and we say foveal hypoplasia, that is not as many cells as in people who are pigmented in that part of the retina called the fovea. There's also misrouting of optic nerves at the optic chiasm. This is the nerve system that delivers visual information from our eyes to the brain. And this misrouting of the optic nerves at the chiasm is at least responsible for a deficit in depth perception. There's also movements of the eye. These different movements include nystagmus and alternating strabismus. And I'll leave it to the ophthalmologist to discuss those in further detail in other sessions. In terms of the variability in albinism, variability is quite large. And we see, if we look at the skin, for example, there's a lot of difference in the amount of pigment in the skin, and that spans virtually all of the albinism genes. We see this variation. So if we look at the skin, this is a cutaway of the skin. Shown at the bottom, sort of an octopus-looking cell. That is a pigment cell, or melanocyte. And within the melanocyte are melanosomes. This is the part of the melanocyte, that pigment cell, that are actually factories in which pigment is made. Melanin pigment is made in these melanosomes, and they are in turn exported into the overlying skin cells, and that gives our skin its pigmentation. Now, the instructions for making melanin in these melanosomes comes from genes in the nucleus of the melanocyte. And that's what we'll talk about today, the inheritance patterns of these genes. So genes are composed of DNA. DNA is found in the nucleus in the form of chromosomes. Chromosomes are very large, long DNA molecules that are coated with proteins, so we can actually visualize them. They're big enough to see under a microscope. Within that chromosome is the DNA, and that's in a double helix shown in this slide. And the language of the genes of that DNA, that language is in letters we call nucleotides. And there are 4 of these letters, and the order of these letters determines the protein structure and even where and when different genes are going to be expressed. So if we look at these chromosomes, we see that human beings have 22 pairs of chromosomes, that we get 1 each from our mothers and our fathers. We also get sex chromosomes, 1 each from each parent. If a person receives an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, that person is going to be male. If they receive 2 X chromosomes, that person is going to be female. Okay, so the genome is pretty big. And if we think of the genome as a kind of a set of books, because after all, it is letters in a sequence. And if we think about this kind of set of books, it's going to be a really, really big set of books. And in fact, it's so big that if we were to recite each of those letters of the genome, one after another, one every second, it would take almost 100 years to read the entire genome. So let's talk about changes in that genome. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes that change is inherited. And sometimes it is kind of spontaneous. It's a slow rate, but DNA does change over time, small changes. And if we think about sort of this nursery rhyme, Mary had a little lamb, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go, right? If one of those letters, for example, the M in Mary, changes to a G, we now suddenly are not talking about Mary, we're talking about Gary. And this is a very different story. And the same thing happens with DNA. Sometimes differences in these letters make a very different outcome. So this is how we look at it. When we look at the double helix, we read, for example, here, TG, AG, AC. And if there's one letter changed, instead of that C, now we have a G, that could encode a very, very different protein. In fact, it could be the difference between the protein working and the protein not working. The genome is pretty big, as I said, and most of the time these changes don't amount to anything. But sometimes they really change even our own appearance. So let's think about the albinism genes in particular. Albinism genes, as I said, there are many of them. And if we look at chromosome 11, we see that chromosome 11 has a gene on it called tyrosinase. And changes in this tyrosinase gene lead to oculocutaneous albinism type 1, or OCA1. On chromosome 15, there's another gene called the P gene, and changes in that gene can lead to oculocutaneous albinism type 2. These oculocutaneous albinism 1 and oculocutaneous albinism 2 are the 2 most common forms of albinism that we see. So if a person, for example, has 2 changes in the tyrosinase gene, one of those changes on a copy inherited from mom, the other change on a copy inherited from dad, and if those changes lead to the inability of tyrosinase to help make melanin protein, that person will have albinism. And in particular, since it's tyrosinase, that person will have oculocutaneous albinism type 1. If that person only has one of those copies that inactivates the tyrosinase gene, then that person is a carrier for albinism. That person doesn't have albinism, and that person is pigmented. So carriers for albinism are not that uncommon. As I said, there are many different types of albinism, but if we add them all together, we find that about one person out of 150 random people who do not have albinism are carriers for one of those types of albinism. And most of them don't know that. So there are carriers for albinism out there all around us. Carrier parents who do not have albinism can have children with albinism, but only if they carry changes in the same gene for that same type of albinism. And even then, most of their children will not have albinism. So we're going to illustrate how that's inherited. So if we have two carrier parents, both of whom do not have albinism, they can have children based on 4 different outcomes. Remember, they have pairs of chromosomes. They give one of those chromosome pairs to their offspring. In this case that's illustrated here, both the mother and the father have given this child a copy of the tyrosinase gene that's able to make melanin. So this child has 2 copies of the tyrosinase gene that's able to make melanin, and this child does not have albinism and is not a carrier like the parents. On the other hand, if a child inherits one of those copies that works and is able to make melanin, and another copy that isn't able to make melanin, that person will be a carrier just like that person's parents. And this can happen in 2 different ways, the way shown and this way as well. And the last way, the last type of inheritance is where both parents give their offspring a copy of the tyrosinase gene that is incapable of making melanin, and that child will have albinism. Okay, so these are the 4 possible outcomes, and each one of them has an equal chance to occur. And at each time this couple has a child, the percentages start over again. So it's like flipping a coin. Sometimes you can flip a coin that's tails, and then the next time it's tails, and the next time it's tails, and the next time it's tails. But if you do this often enough, you find a 50-50 split. In this case, with 2 carrier parents, we find that on average, 25% of their offspring will be pigmented and non-carriers. 50% of the offspring will be pigmented and carriers. And 25% of their offspring will have albinism. So if, on the other hand, we have a carrier parent and a parent with albinism, in this particular scenario, 50% of their offspring will be carriers, and 50% of their offspring will have albinism. So this is a different scenario. In this case, only one of the parents is a carrier, and the other parent has albinism. Now, this also brings to mind that if a person with albinism, let's see, the next one. If a person with albinism has children with a non-carrier parent, none of their children will have albinism, but all of their children will be carriers. And to make things even more interesting, if both parents have albinism, but they're different genes, different types of albinism, they're going to be inherited independently. And so you could have a scenario where both parents have albinism. Perhaps one is OCA1, the other is OCA2. None of their children will have albinism, but all of them will be carriers for both types of albinism. So in studies of different kinds of albinism, we also have animal models, which are shown on the bottom. And we use both the animal models and sometimes cells from donors who have albinism to try to better understand what are the functions of the genes that encode products that are important for albinism. We also know that there are different types of albinism, as I said. These are some of the more recent forms of albinism that have been uncovered. Another type of albinism that's important to note is X-linked albinism or ocular albinism 1, OA1. In this case, we see almost exclusively this in boys. Typically, we find an unaffected father and a carrier mother, and their offspring are shown here. We have 25% of the time, we would have an unaffected son. 25% of the time, we'd have an unaffected daughter. 25% of the time, we'd have a carrier daughter. And 25% of the time, we'd have an affected son. So since this is mostly or almost exclusively seen in males, the probabilities are that 50% of the sons are affected, or 25% of their offspring, but none of the daughters are affected, but half of the daughters, 50% of the daughters, would also be carriers. So this is a much more complicated type of inheritance pattern. And we often see women with other forms of albinism classified as OA1 or ocular albinism. So it's important to make a distinction here between ocular features of albinism that everyone who has albinism shares and the genetic classification of ocular albinism. Again, ocular albinism, that in a genetic sense, is seen almost exclusively in males. There are rare cases of females with X-linked ocular albinism, but again, that's a very rare thing. So moving on to what we know about the different genes involved in albinism. If we hone in on those factories that make pigment in the skin cells, those melanosomes, we can actually see what the genes that are responsible for several different forms of albinism, what those genes actually do. So shown here in the circle, the big circle in this slide, is one of those factories that make melanin. And shown in the bright yellow, bold, are the proteins encoded by OCA1, OCA2, OCA3, OCA4, and OCA6, and what they do. So it's important to note that there's only really one enzyme involved in making melanin, and that is encoded by OCA1, or which encodes the enzyme tyrosinase. And all the other proteins that are involved in making melanin actually help to set the stage for that process. And if we look at the different forms of albinism, what we find is that in all forms of OCA, there's reduced or absent melanin. And that melanin, as I said, is made from the amino acid tyrosine. So tyrosine is the initial building block for making melanin. It gets converted early on into a chemical called DOPA, also known as L-DOPA. And that DOPA ultimately makes melanin. There's kind of a pause in making melanin from tyrosine to DOPA. And we think that DOPA is very, very important in a number of things, independent really of pigment. Because the condition of ocular albinism encodes a kind of receptor, kind of ear that hears that signal of DOPA. And that signaling between DOPA and its receptor is critically important in the development of a normal visual system. So this has led to lots of different studies to look at whether or not we can augment DOPA to correct some of the vision problems in people with albinism. It's quite complex because the visual system develops very early in life. We're not certain that that DOPA would help people who are older that have albinism, but it's still quite possible, although our studies have been mixed as to whether or not DOPA given early in childhood could spare some vision. So those are some of the things that we're working on that the genetics has actually given us enough information to even start and continue clinical trials to improve vision in people with albinism. So lastly, I'd like to make a few comments here that albinism in some human populations is rather ancient. In Africans and Native Americans in particular, we find that albinism has been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And that being a carrier for OCA2 might actually confer an advantage to some populations. So this is a family that I've studied over the years. And in this family, what I found was that they had a missing bit of the OCA2 gene that led to albinism in this family, shown on the left. At the same time, I was looking at populations in Africa and actually found the exact same genetic change in populations in Africa, shown here, a little girl from Zimbabwe. The family on the left is from Southern Maryland and has been in Southern Maryland since the earliest colonial period. Now, how did albinism show up in that family? Well, as we know, Africans were enslaved and brought to the New World. And many of those Africans came from the Benin population in Africa and brought to the New World. When we look at this same deletion, that is that same genetic signature in that OCA2 gene, we find that this has been present in the Bantu language culture for more than 2,500 years and is coincident with the expansion of the Bantu-speaking peoples. In fact, we think, and we've been able to trace this particular OCA2 change in African Americans probably to the Bemliki people in Cameroon, where it became a marker for a royal lineage. One of the Bemliki kings who lived more than 400 years ago had albinism, and he had many, many children, some of whom we believe were captured and sent to the Americas as slaves in the early part of the slave trade. An interesting feature of this same OCA2 gene is shown here. Now, you only have to look at what's in the red boxes. So this is looking at the amino acid sequence of the OCA2 protein compared to the amino acid sequence of a gene found in microbacteria. So microbacteria are a type of bacteria that account for things like tuberculosis and leprosy. And what we find is that there's a very high correlation between the OCA2 protein and a protein called L32 found in Mycobacterium leprae, or the leprosy bacteria. And leprosy has been endemic in the world for eons. We think that the origin of leprosy was in an area that's sort of the southern part of the current country of Tanzania, where OCA2 is quite common. And one of the first signs of leprosy, of course, is white spotting. So the leprosy bacteria actually does something to melanocytes. So there's a link between melanocytes and the leprosy bacteria. And we think that actually being a carrier for oculocutaneous albinism type 2 may confer a small advantage against leprosy to populations in and around leprosy endemic areas, which is where we see the highest concentrations of people with OCA2. I'd also like to mention, and I'm sure that will be covered at this conference, is the plight of the people who have albinism in Tanzania, where many of these folks are hunted for their body parts for witchcraft. Together with several NGOs, including Under the Same Sun. I've worked with Under the Same Sun, for example, and they provide schools and safe places for children with albinism in Tanzania and other parts of East Africa. And I've also done some work in something called Albino Island. I didn't name this, but this was on the Learning Channel some years ago, and you can find it on YouTube if you're interested. I've continued this work with the UN Human Rights Council for protection of people with albinism, in particular in East Africa. So one of the problems, though, for these folks is that they're also subject to skin cancer. And if they aren't killed by witch doctors for their body parts for witchcraft, they can develop and die from skin cancer. So this is also a big issue in Africa. And another NGO that's been very helpful here is Standing Voice. So I would encourage you all to also look them up. And it does take a village. And so I'd like to acknowledge a large number of collaborators, in particular, some of my early collaborators, Dr. King, Dr. Whitcup, Dr. Summers, and more recent collaborators like, for example, Dr. Carroll, and all the people that have worked in my laboratory over the past 35 years to try to better understand the genetics of albinism, and also to try to understand this with the aim to ultimately develop therapeutics to help people with albinism see better. And I want to thank you for your attention.
Hi, this is Sheila Adamo. I'm here to talk to you about the Parent Connections program that has been going for the last 6 years, connecting parents of children of albinism of all ages across the country, Canada, and actually other countries too, if they're able to call in. This program meets twice a month, sometimes in the day and sometimes in the evening. You just have to pay attention to the schedule that's posted on the NOAA website. And we bring into your house via your internet support from other parents as well as other professionals in the field. As a member of Parent Connections, we also record the calls, and you are able to have access to those calls if you missed a call. So to join Parent Connections, just go to the NOAA website, find Parent Connections, fill out the brief intake form. You'll have a short conversation with me, and then you're in Parent Connections. If you're a current member of Parent Connections, thank you, and I look forward to connecting with you again shortly. Talk to you all soon. Bye.